On January the 1st of 1951, a young Cuban nationalist named Fidel Castro drove his guerrilla army into Havana and overthrew General Fulgencio Batista, the nation's American-backed president. For the next 2 years, officials at the U.S. State Department and the CIA attempted to push Castro from power. Finally, in April of 1961, the CIA launched what its leaders believed would be the definitive strike, a full-scale invasion of Cuba by 1,400 American-trained Cubans who had fled their homes when Castro took over. However, the invasion did not go too well. The invaders were badly outnumbered by Castro's troops, and they surrendered after less than 24 hours of fighting. Many Cubans welcomed Fidel Castro's 1959 overthrow of the president Fulgencio Batista, yet the new order on the island, just about 100 miles from the United States, made American officials quite nervous. Batista had been a corrupt and repressive dictator, but at least he was considered to be pro-American and was an ally to the US companies. At that time, American corporations and wealthy individuals owned almost half of Cuba's sugar plantations and the majority of its cattle ranches, mines, and utilities. Batista did little to restrict their operations. He was also reliably anti-communist. Castro, by contrast, disapproved of the approach that Americans took to their businesses and interests in Cuba. It was time, he believed, for Cubans to assume more control of their nation. Almost as soon as he came to power, Castro took steps to reduce American influence on the island. He nationalized American-dominated industries such as sugar and mining, introduced land reform schemes, and called on other Latin American governments to act with more autonomy. In response, early in 1960, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to recruit 1,400 Cuban exiles living in Miami and begin training them to overthrow Castro. In May of 1960, Fidel Castro established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, and the United States responded by prohibiting the importation of Cuban sugar. To prevent the Cuban economy from collapsing, sugar exports to the United States compromised 80% of the country's total. The USSR agreed to buy the sugar. In January of 1961, the US government severed diplomatic relations with Cuba and stepped up its preparations for an invasion. Some State Department and other advisors to the new American president, John F. Kennedy, maintained that Castro posed no real threat to America, but the new president believed that masterminding the Cuban leader's removal would show Russia, China, and skeptical Americans that he was serious about winning the Cold War. President Kennedy had inherited Eisenhower's CIA campaign to train and equip a guerrilla army of Cuban exiles, but he had some doubts about the wisdom of the plan. The last thing he wanted, he said, was direct overt intervention by the American military in Cuba. The Soviets would likely see this as an act of war and might retaliate. However, CIA officers told him they could keep US involvement in the invasion a secret, and if all went according to plan, the campaign would spark an anti-Castro uprising on the island. The first part of the plan was to destroy Castro's tiny air force, making it impossible for his military to resist the invaders. On April the 15th of 1961, a group of Cuban exiles took off from Nicaragua in a squadron of American B-26 bombers, painted to look like stolen Cuban planes, and conducted a strike against Cuban airfields. However, it turned out that Castro and his advisors knew about the raid and had moved his planes out of harm's way. Frustrated, Kennedy began to suspect that the plan the CIA had promised would be both clandestine and successful might in fact be too large to be clandestine and too small to be successful. But unfortunately, it was too late to apply the brakes. On April the 17th, the Cuban Exile Brigade began its invasion at an isolated spot on the island's southern shore known as the Bay of Pigs. Almost immediately, the invasion was a disaster. The CIA had wanted to keep it a secret for as long as possible, but a radio station on the beach broadcast every details of the operations to listeners across Cuba. Unexpected coral reefs sank some of the exiled ships as they pulled into the shore. Backup paratroopers landed in the wrong place. Before long, Castro's troops had pinned the invaders on the beach, and the exiles surrendered after less than a day of fighting. 114 were killed, and over 1,100 were taken prisoner. According to many historians, the CIA and the Cuban Exile Brigade believed that President Kennedy would eventually allow the American military to intervene in Cuba on their behalf. However, the president was resolute. As much as he did not want to abandon Cuba to the communists, he said he would not start a fight that might end in World War III. His efforts to overthrow Castro never flagged. In November of 1961, he approved Operation Mongoose, an espionage and sabotage campaign, but never went so far as to provoke an outright war. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis inflamed American-Cuban-Soviet tensions even further.